Hi, good afternoon. Hi, good afternoon. I'm Tim, and we have a great panel. And we're going to improvise a little bit, just like the musicians did. So instead of taking a break, we're going to go right into our panel discussion. And first panelist, can you hear me? Okay. The first panelist would be Dave Iwataki. So, if you could talk about how you came to Bronzeville, how you came to write this, what inspired you about Bronzeville?
Oh, I was walking around Little Tokyo with my wife one day, and I passed by a restaurant or storefront. I can't remember because it's getting really old. And there was a photo. It was two black gentlemen sitting at a counter being waited on by another black gentleman behind the counter. And they were smiling at the camera through the storefront window. And I'm pretty sure it said Mitsuru Grill. And I was like, what? When did this happen? And so that stuck in my mind for years. And then a few years later, California's Civil Liberties Public Education Program put out a request for proposals to help bring more recognition to the last remaining Little Tokyos, LA, San Francisco, and San Jose. And I remember that picture, and I did some research, and I found out that it was Bronzeville, and Miles Davis, Charlie Parker, Billie Holiday, all these people played in Little Tokyo. And I was like, wow, that's, you know. And my wife recently said, she posted on Facebook something like, the suite, J-Town Bronzeville suite, is kind of like a metaphor for my life. And it's, you know, I think kind of a metaphor for anybody that grew up in Los Angeles. So that was the origin of this. Okay, so a little bit more. So it was a challenge for me to try to represent traditional Japanese culture, but ever since I was little, growing up in Los Angeles, you know, you listen to R&B, rock and roll, salsa. You know, my cousin used to play Joe Cuba and Mongo Santa Maria. And, you know, when I got into music, the more I became passionate about it. I longed for a Japanese-American music, and you know, it's like, what is that? Well, you know, Hiroshima came around, and there's almost the only thing out there for Japanese-American music. And you know, this is just an attempt to try and develop some more avenues. And Yuki was soloing on these songs, and she was really improvising. I mean, she didn't play any two solos twice in all the rehearsals that we did. You know, she's playing 5 notes on these jazz changes, and then she's doing pitch bends with her 2 fingers, and she's bending a half step and then another half step right on pitch. I mean, she was, my hat's off to you. And then, you know, another example of blending cultures, Rumi has her own Latin jazz ensemble. She's got a master's degree in Latin jazz, so she was born. And then the history that these gentlemen brought, you know, they brought that. So I feel really fortunate to have I'm so glad, you know, all of you are here. This isn't just for Japanese American. That's the whole point. But thank you all.
Thank you, Dave. Our next panelist is Kurt Salsby.
Thank you. I heard a quote yesterday that applies to me, and that is, God doesn't call the equipped, God equips the called. I was not equipped, but I was called. I grew up in Inglewood, third generation Angelino native. Heard the stories about old Los Angeles from my parents. When I got interested in jazz, I loved hearing my dad tell me about running around on Central Avenue in the late 30s, what the Club Alabama was like. So I had a taste for the history of black jazz in Los Angeles. Then I became interested in the music enough to start writing about it. I've been publishing about jazz for over 40 years. I write for Downbeat magazine. And time after time after time, Bronzeville would be presented to me. My first interview was with the great trumpeter Art Farmer, who told me about running around on Central Avenue as a teenager with Charlie Parker, going from one after-hours club to the other, and about hearing Charlie Parker and Miles Davis at this place in Little Tokyo called the Finale Club. I'd heard about the Finale Club because I read about it in Ross Russell's biography of Charlie Parker, Bird Lives. And I knew that the place was run by a guy named Foster Johnson. And I went to hear John Hendricks one night in 1981, and lo and behold, on the bill, on the show, was this elegant, older, white-haired tap dancer who danced like nobody's business. And I introduced myself and went to his studio the next day, and we were good friends at the end of his life. And he told me many things about Bronzeville and the Finale Club and his career. And these things just kept presenting themselves to me. My friendships with the Central Avenue jazz musicians, Gerald Wilson and Ernie Andrews and Clora Bryant, so many of them, and Henry Franklin, whose father was a Central Avenue band leader, trumpeter Sammy Franklin. And they would tell me about these things and about these clubs and the people who came in and the wild stories. And so this material came to me, and I was just open enough to receive it. 10 years ago, I was just about to hand in an article about Charlie Parker at the Finale Club to the Downtown News. And I thought, just for the heck of it, and I got on the internet and I searched Charlie Parker Finale Club, and I came across the name of this composer who was finishing up a suite that he called J-Town Bronzeville. In less than an hour, we were on the phone together. And before we hung up, Davey Wataki said, I want you to come and speak at my premiere. So I've been fortunate enough to be a part of these since he's been doing them. And so just to take, for one, Shep's Playhouse, which was on First and San Pedro. It was the jewel of Bronzeville. It was 2 stories high. There was a piano lounge on the ground floor, and upstairs there were shows, reviews, produced by a man named Leonard Reed, who was a very renowned tap dancer. With his partner, Willie Bryant, they had innovated what came to be called the BS chorus. And every tap dancer anywhere knows the BS chorus. It's the lingua franca of tap dancing. And here was Leonard Reed producing shows, wonderful shows with comedians and singers and chorus girls and wonderful jazz bands. In November of 1944, Leonard Reed called up Gerald Wilson, who had settled in Los Angeles, came off the road with the Jimmy Lunsford Band, wasn't doing much, and Leonard Reed said, "Do you think you could get a band together? Herb Jeffries is coming in here, and Bardu Ali's got to go over to the Lincoln Theater. We need a band." Gerald Wilson started his orchestra on that much, and it became the longest running jazz orchestra in the history of Los Angeles jazz. So all these things are still with us. Ernie Andrews is still here, he's still performing. Clora Bryant is still with us. And we have this wonderful legacy in the short little Bronzeville era. The Charlie Parker Dizzy Gillespie Band finished up its run at Billy Berg's Supper Club in Hollywood in January of '46. The whole band went back to New York except for Charlie Parker. He was at Liberty, wasn't doing anything, just looking for a place to play. He started playing at the Finale Club. Foster Johnson was running the shows there, bringing in comics and dancers and singers, but he had this band that he let Charlie Parker put together. Miles Davis had come to Los Angeles with the Benny Carter Orchestra, specifically to be where Charlie Parker was. So in the spring of 1946, the locus of modern jazz was not in Harlem, was not on 52nd Street in New York City, was not on the East Coast. It was in Bronzeville. Every modern jazz musician, from the Gene Krupa Orchestra, the Boyd Rayburn Orchestra, the Stan Kenton Orchestra, all of them, west of the Rockies, came to the Finale Club to hear Charlie Parker and his new trumpeter, Miles Davis.
Our next speaker is Dr. Hillary Jenks.
Shorter than Kirk by a mile. Okay. Well, first of all, I just want to thank the Reading Valley Japanese Cultural Institute for making this happen, because I last heard that piece of music 10 years ago, and I love it just as much today as I did then. It is so amazing, and so I'm so glad we all got to hear it today. I'm the historian, so I'm supposed to provide the story of how Little Tokyo became Little Tokyo, and then Bronzeville, and then went back to being Little Tokyo again. Now, frankly, I think Dave and these amazing musicians kind of already did that really well. Yeah. But if you had questions about any of the details, I am here to fill in some gaps for you. So the first thing I'll just say to know about Little Tokyo is, when did it become Little Tokyo? Well, if we go back to the late 19th century, there's a couple of historians who said actually you could have called it Little Berlin, because Germans were the single largest nationality in the neighborhood at the time. And there was a big German brewery down there. Another thing to know about it is that before the LA River was encased in concrete, it used to flood during the spring rains every year. And sometimes it would flood all the way up to Main Street. So a lot of the area that Little Tokyo is on used to be very marginal land with low rents, because you might get flooded every year. So that's why you had a lot of immigrants who moved into that neighborhood. It was also an early African-American neighborhood, the earliest African-American neighborhood in LA. So African-Americans settled in this area around First, San Pedro, Azusa, and then they sort of spread over to Central Avenue and south down Central Avenue. So there were roots for the community even before Bronzeville in that neighborhood. So you can date the Japanese presence in the neighborhood to around the mid-1800s, but it wasn't until 1905 that it started to get called Little Tokyo in like the English language press. That's the first mention in the LA Times of that term, Little Tokyo. And then by the 1920s, it grew very rapidly, and it became the established social and commercial center for Issei and Nisei communities. And now, obviously, a lot of those folks were not living in Little Tokyo, because you had fishing communities and farming communities all over Southern California. But this was a big area for cultural activities, churches, temples, stores, things like that. The other thing to know, well, that's a great picture to give an indication of the institutional importance of the neighborhood. The other thing to know, though, is that Little Tokyo, even though it's getting called Little Tokyo, it's not like it's an only Japanese-American space. This kind of happens when you name this place, you forget everyone who doesn't get counted in the name. But actually, Koyoshi Uono is a Japanese gentleman who did his master's thesis at USC in 1928. He said, actually, of the 30 hotels and rooming houses in the district in the late 1920s, 1/3 of them were inhabited completely by white workers, still at that time. And the 1940 census said, well, the resident population is about 30 to 36% Japanese, and the rest, there were substantial numbers of white, black, and Spanish surnamed residents as well. They didn't have a category to include Mexican folks, so they called them Spanish surnamed. So there's a tradition that Bronzeville continued of different communities negotiating shared space despite language differences, job competition, racial discrimination, all of that. What's a little different and historically significant about Bronzeville, Little Tokyo, is the degree to which state interference played a role in shaping those relationships and moving people in and out of the neighborhood. So, as we all know, Alvin mentioned earlier, President Roosevelt's approval of Executive Order 9066 in 1942 meant that there were mandatory evacuations of all ethnic Japanese in LA County, immigrant and citizen alike, beginning in April of that year. Now the neighborhood they left behind is empty, right? All of the people are gone, all the stores are empty. But the other thing about it is that it was also considered still sort of un-American. I have a LA Times quote from July 1942 that said, Little Tokyo is a city within a city which honest American citizens view with large and disturbing questions in their minds. And the property owners in the district are mostly not Japanese because of the alien land law that said if you were ineligible for citizenship, you couldn't buy land. So most of the property owners were doing everything they could to sort of erase the Japanese-ness of Little Tokyo, as you can see. They were still having trouble renting it out, though. The mayor actually was looking into using the buildings for storage because he didn't know what else to do with it. And if you think about where City Hall is, he's literally going to work every day in and out through a ghost town, so it was really upsetting him. Not that we really like Mayor Bauer anyway. So what the mayor didn't take into account, what the property owners didn't take into account, was that there was going to be this huge influx of African American war workers because we had all of the shipbuilding facilities and all of the airplane building facilities and all of that. And there was another executive order. This is the thing about executive orders, they give and they take. Executive Order 8802 that said there will be no discrimination on the basis of race in the defense industries. So suddenly, you had actual decent, good-paying manufacturing jobs open to African Americans, and that had not been the case before. So by mid-1943, there was an average of 5,500 African American folks coming into LA every single month. That's a lot of people. And the thing to remember is at that point in time, also in the city of Los Angeles, 90% of the city of LA was covered by restrictive housing covenants, so that and under the deed covenant, it would say Negroes cannot occupy this house or this apartment building or what have you. So this meant there was really no place for all these new arrivals to go. You have 5,500 people a month. They can go to Central Avenue, West Adams, a couple of these kinds of neighborhoods. Those get overcrowded really quickly with those kind of numbers. So Little Tokyo was open and unrestricted space, and that is sort of how it happened that all of these folks moved in there. And that's how Bronzeville was born. So given the magnitude of the influx and the fact that if you think about it, Little Tokyo is kind of a small place, Bronzeville also got overcrowded really quickly as well. So there's several pictures taken at the time they were doing surveys and public health reports because they were looking at a place where maybe 20,000 people total had lived prior to the evacuation, and by 1945, they were saying they thought as many as 80,000 people were living in that space. So they took over a lot of areas that weren't houses. They'd been warehouses and all kinds of things, and were trying to live in them and didn't have enough toilets. So it was a very difficult situation. Josh Sides, who's another historian, he called this the prosperous ghetto effect. You have new employment opportunities and new wage scales, but there's so many people coming in and so few places where they can live that you have more money coming in, but no matter how much you have to spend on your housing, you can't find decent housing. I also like to sort of think that Bronzeville was crowded not just physically but spiritually, because the previous occupants were sort of these specters, like they're not dead, they've just been sent away by unseen forces, but their stuff is everywhere around you. But Bronzeville did offer these amazing opportunities for entrepreneurship and for cultural expression, as Kurt and Dave talked about, and I won't talk about the clubs because they did, but I will mention, because some people always ask me this, why did they start calling it Bronzeville? And the best guess we have is there was a hotel proprietor named Leonard Christmas from Massachusetts, and he's the one we think came up with the name. He's the first one we know using it. And he created a Chamber of Commerce, the Bronzeville Chamber of Commerce, and they sent out these placards that said, "This is Bronzeville, watch us grow." So they were very excited about the opportunities there. So then we get to January 1945. The order that is barring Japanese Americans from the West Coast is lifted. People can start coming back. And by the end of 1946, you had 60% of the pre-war Japanese American population, so that's between about 25 and 28,000 people, came back to LA County. Now, there's a housing crisis going on. We've just demobilized from the war, so there's also an employment crisis going on. Like, this is not a good moment, really, in a lot of ways, to be coming back to Los Angeles with nothing and trying to reestablish yourself. So it's really kind of a moment of crisis in a lot of ways. And I can talk a lot about how they also got harassed by the state and all kinds of other things, but I don't really have time to do that. So, one thing I will say is that when they came back to Little Tokyo, African Americans were very welcoming. The Chamber of Commerce hosted a welcoming reception. When Kichi Ueda opened his store, it was the first Japanese-run store to open again in Little Tokyo, Bronzeville. They brought him like floral wreaths to say congratulations on opening your store. Another thing to think, though, is that we're still thinking about the property owners. The property owners are neither African American nor Japanese American. And for the most part, what the choice they made was when the leases that the African American merchants had taken out expired, they rented to Japanese American folks instead of renewing the lease of the African American merchants. And that had a lot to do with how quickly the commercial nature of the neighborhood went back to Japanese American. That obviously led to a lot of tensions. In the community, there's a housing crisis going on, and you have someone showing up with a sublease and then saying, okay, I'm evicting everyone in this building. This is not a positive interaction. And then additionally, there was a couple of Nisei veterans that the Japanese business group hired to patrol the streets after dark. And this was taken as some sort of vigilante move, and there was a lot of anger. But they hired, the Japanese Business Association hired Kenji Ito, who was a Nisei attorney, to sort of go and talk to the African American organizations and say, we don't mean it to seem like we're moving you out. And they actually asked him directly, are you trying to kick us out? And Kenji Ito on the record said, Japanese don't believe in evacuation. Subtle, but pointed. And as Dave mentioned, there were also a lot of ways that people connected, and like this is a great example. Kichi hired African American people to work in his store. There was a lot of that back and forth, a lot of like really deliberate efforts to learn to live together as one community. And the reason that Bronzeville sort of ceased to exist was less because of these kinds of disputes that did happen, but because of further state action. So basically, the neighborhood was considered, whether it's Japanese American or African American, that's not considered valuable real estate in the late 1940s. And so the state came in and said, we're gonna take out this entire block and build Parker Center. So that took out a lot of new or recently reestablished Japanese American businesses. It also evicted 3,000 people from apartments and hotels on that block, and 90% of the people evicted were African American. So that's kind of where Bronzeville went, ultimately. So for me, the legacies of this story really continue to impact the landscape and the social fabric of LA. We often try to fix and simplify fluid and dynamic places with these simple names and these simple stories, and they're not simple. And Kathy, I think, is going to talk a little bit about that sense I mentioned of ghosts and being haunted. So I would just ask you to think a little bit about how your own neighborhood might be haunted by these kinds of hidden paths, too.
Dr. James, in your opinion, what has been the ripple effect of Bronzeville? For example, I have a lot of cousins and friends who grew up in the Crenshaw area. And as you know, Crenshaw was African American and also Japanese American. Do you think Bronzeville had any impact on that, or in any other ways or areas of LA?
Well, I think what's important to kind of recognize is that Bronzeville is a moment in a much longer history. So, I mean, there's African and Japanese Americans living together and having really interesting connections in the neighborhood around USC and Senshin before the war. And that matters. Like, one of the attorneys who fought for Japanese American civil rights during the war and to get the internment order rescinded was an African American attorney from that neighborhood. And his son grew up, he used to go to Japanese school with his neighbors. So they had these like very tight connections. And then that continued after Bronzeville through Crenshaw, and I've also done research on Gardena. It's been part of the story of Gardena, and basically throughout the history of these two communities in LA, they're very intertwined, although a lot of times people don't necessarily know that or understand the length of that history.
Who was the attorney?
Hugh Macbeth.
Does anyone have any question of Dr. James? We have a couple of minutes. Oh, yes.
Where do we go for more info? Is there a book or?
There's a couple of great things. The easiest thing you can access is there is a wonderful website that was put together by Martha Nakagawa. Shout out to Martha. Which I'm gonna not remember the URL for because it changed. The original domain, like she lost the copyright, she had she didn't own it anymore, she had to move it. But it's like bronzeville-la.org or something. But she did amazing research. She's kind of the original, she got a grant, and she's one of the original people to learn this story. So that would be one place. The other place I would say is there's a great book called, I believe, The Great Black Way. It's R.J. Smith's book about about Central Avenue, but he has 2 chapters in there where he talks quite a bit about Bronzeville, and I really enjoyed that.
You mentioned who came up with the name Bronzeville, but why the name Bronze?
Oh, yeah, so as far as we know, because no one found Leonard Christmas to interview him, but as far as we know, it was sort of taken off of the Chicago idea, the south side of Chicago, which was like one of the largest black neighborhoods in the country at that time, was colloquially called Bronzeville. So we think he was sort of echoing that idea. And we're going to be as big as Chicago.
We're going to have to move on to our next person. Well, thank you, Dr. James.
Thank you.
I'd like to welcome Kathy Foley.
I'm Kathy Foley-Meyer. I'm a mixed media artist, and back in 2013, I created a project called Project Bronzeville, which was a multidisciplinary art project. It was a art exhibit, a play called Bronzeville that the Roby Theater produced, and we had a jazz concert at the Blue Whale, and then we also had a symposium that Hillary was a part of. And it's kind of fitting that I am the last person to speak because all of the people that spoke before me were part of the inspiration for the project. Hillary was speaking before about ghosts, and back in the mid-90s, I took photographs of Little Tokyo, and I just had the vague feeling that African Americans had lived there, but I didn't have any information about it. So I started doing some research, and in the middle of doing my research, I also came across Kirk's article about Charlie Parker in the Downtown News. So that was a source of inspiration. And then I took a tour with the LA Conservancy, and the first words out of the guy's mouth, because we were in Little Tokyo, and she said, well, this used to be a black neighborhood. And then a few years later, I started making art because I was so inspired by it. And the photograph that's up right now is actually the second piece I made. It's called Bronzeville 3, and it's 3 glass panels. And I cast my hands in glass, and I'm actually spelling out the word Bronzeville from left to right. And then there are, it's kind of hard to see in this picture, but there are names of businesses like Leonard Christmas that Hillary mentioned before, and the Finale Club, are etched into the glass panels that are behind the hands. And then each panel has a Japanese character, and if you read it across, the literal translation is Blue Copper Town, which is not Bronzeville, but if you put blue and bronze together, it's kind of the same thing. So we're gonna improvise, so I'm just gonna take you through, I'm not really sure what's gonna come up next, but, So this is actually an edition of Ebony magazine. There's a photograph that's going to come up later that was taken in 1946 at a newsstand, and we were able to date that photograph because there's actually a poster of, that's Dorothy Donegan. There's actually a poster kind of attached to the newsstand. Researching Bronzeville is sort of, well, it's like an archaeological dig. You know, there are little bits of information everywhere. I actually got a big boost one day when I did a short talk about Bronzeville in front of the Will Fandel Club, which is the oldest Black women's club in Los Angeles. And I met a woman, once I started to talk about Bronzeville, she actually got very emotional. And she said, you know, you just reminded me of my Japanese sister. Her family, she was African American, but her family had lived next door to a Japanese family. And when they were taken away, the African American family held on to their possessions in their garage so that they would not get stolen. And the families were very close. And when you know, the internment period was over, they remained close, but actually I think this family eventually moved away. But she said, you know, I have not thought about, as she called her, my Japanese sister in years. So little stories like that would kind of motivate me to keep going. And one of my other inspirations, this is actually a photograph of an installation that you can see right now. It's on First Street, and it's called Remembering Old Little Tokyo, and it's Sheila DeVront de Vetvril and Sonia Ishii's installation, and it's in 3 parts. These are brass inlays, I believe, or bronze, and there are quotes in the streets from the people that used to live there, and then there's also a timeline. See if I can get that to come out. Nope, that's a different one. There's also a timeline of the businesses, Japanese businesses that were there, and then there are also etchings of some of the things that they took with them when they went into camps. This is the poster for our jazz concert that we had, featuring the Miguel Atwood Ferguson Ensemble, so at the Blue Whale, and that was back in 2013. This is another art piece that I did. It's printed on glass, and it's photographs and also sort of drawings from the period. And then you can kind of see in the corner there's an edition of the California Eagle with the headline, "We Got the Little Tokyo Blues," and that's basically about the housing situation in Little Tokyo during Bronzeville. This was actually also one of my favorite. I used this as the icon image for our project, but you can kind of see the Bronzeville 5 and dime there in the corner. And let's see. This is the first Bronzeville piece that I did, which is a light box that actually lights up from the bottom, and it has pictures and articles from the Bronzeville period, and it's got a little kind of neon, Japanese pagoda style neon on the top, and then Bronzeville is etched into the front there. And the art exhibit we had was at, I don't know if I said this before, but it was at LA Art Corps, which is part of the Union Center for the Arts in Little Tokyo. I also came across a photographer who was African American and was married to a Japanese woman, and when she was taken away, he actually went with her and stayed in the town where her family was being held. And then when they got out, they came back to Los Angeles, and he was a photographer for the black newspapers in town. And it's a picture of him in the top left, he and his daughter, and then his family, who's actually not in the picture because he's taking it, but his wife's family, or his family, taken at Thanksgiving. And it was just, his life struck me as an example of just how, you know, integrated people's lives are, how you just cannot kind of separate us. People are gonna do what they're gonna do. They're gonna fall in love, they're going to have kids, and, you know, support each other through difficult times. Okay, so this is my version of the photograph that I mentioned before. It's called City on the Edge of Forever because it's a photograph taken in front of the Civic Hotel, and whenever I would look at it, I would just feel like you could step right into it kind of like that episode of Star Trek where they have a time machine and you just step into it and disappear into that time period. And I would feel that every time I looked at that photograph, so I added some color to it, and then I printed it on GNA glass, which is a type of glass that actually kind of has movement in it when you look at it. I was also really interested in the displacement, and I used to do a lot of work with glass because I was interested in transparency. So this is actually, it's kind of hard to see, but it's an apartment building made of glass, and the people are also made of glass, and I was really interested in the concept of the fragility of lives, the transparency of lives, the fact that people in these situations often don't have much privacy. So there are people made of glass, both yellow and brown people made of glass, and then there's a series of photographs that scrolls on an electric picture frame that is kind of standing in front of them. Oops, let's go back there. And also, speaking of displacement, I was very much interested in the movement of people, in and out of homes. The fact that, there were homes that were occupied by Japanese, and then they were forced to leave, and then, basically, essentially strangers moved in. So that's what this sort of untitled piece is about. Let's see if I can end. The other, we got the Little Tokyo Blues, I think I referenced before in the other piece with the article from the California Eagle. So this is another shot of the installation that was part of my inspiration, which is remembering old Little Tokyo. So I encourage everyone to go down and check it out if you have a chance. I just want to show one more. That's a close-up of that, if I can. Okay, so this I came across in my research. It's a magazine called The Bronze, which was actually published in an office on the top floor of Club Alabama. And it's where, I think earlier when Dave was showing his photographs, there were some ads of jazz clubs, and they actually came from this magazine. And I also wanted to mention the other thing was, one of my earliest inspirations was Dave Iwataki's J-Town Bronzeville Suite, because I heard it for the first time during the promo for the Central Avenue Jazz Festival, I guess 10 years ago. So, but I think I have to wrap it up. Thank you very much.
Again, to all our panelists, Dave Iwataki, Dr. Hilary Jenks, Kirk Silsby, and Kathy Bodenmeyer. If you have further questions for them, they'll be around after today's show. A few things I wanted to mention here. We have a number of people I'd like to thank. First of all, the GBJCI's program coordinator, Nicole Sato. I don't know where she is. She's always running around. Also, thank you to the planning committee. If you guys could raise your hands. They helped put this program together. In particular, I'd like to mention a committee member, Catherine Endo Roberts, who, because of a scheduling conflict, couldn't be here today, but it was her enthusiasm for this topic that really got the ball rolling. So, thank you to her. Now, I'd also like to point out that the Gardena Valley Japanese Cultural Institute is a nonprofit organization. So if you enjoyed today's program and you'd like to see more programs like it, there is a donation box back there by the table. And we'd appreciate it if you left a little something, or a big something. So, again, thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to Dave Iwataki and his fabulous musicians. And we've got food that's been donated from Gardena Bowl Coffee Shop. So please stick around and have some food. One more thank you again to LA County Supervisor Mark Ridley Thomas for funding this program. And Thank you again to all of you for attending today.